Pokémon has been the series of my life, but love is always bound to death. And every episode of this legend, every game of the franchise has something that I don't like. Today we will finally take a look at the worst, on a more subjective level, of every game in the series. Get ready for this journey of heartbreaks, betrayal, and disappointment that begins with Red and Blue. It's pretty hard to pick one thing in particular since, for obvious reasons, these games are nowadays pretty clunky as a result of all the quality of life improvements and iterations that generation after generation the franchise had yet to make. But that would be quite unfair for me since that's what evolution is all about. If I really had to choose the worst thing about these games, I would try to find something that was poorly made and affected the game experience back in the day, without being influenced by everything that could come later. And I know this may be rather unpopular, but the Kanto region has always felt generic and somewhat forgettable for me, at least compared to the others. This is largely related to the fact that the series was born as a reflection of Satoshi Tajiri's own childhood. Many of the locations are inspired by places he visited as a child, which has its own charm, but in practice makes the region feel bland and mundane in contrast to the fantasy world of future generations. All cities appear to be the same, distinguished only by their main attraction or point of interest, which in general also tend to be rather cliché and generic. The same goes for dungeons and routes, which feel like extensions of land that only exist to connect cities to each other without any thought to their design or coherence, if you are looking for an exciting world to explore. And that's indeed what I'm mainly after when playing Pokémon. The Kanto games are the last ones I would recommend. It seems like I can't do one of these videos without giving a weird and controversial opinion, but I think I've never mentioned how Yellow is definitely one of my least favorites of the franchise, and perhaps the game I would be least excited to play to date. To the overall not very enjoyable today first generation experience, there are just a couple of new features, such as the starring role of Pikachu and the presence of the 3 starters. As a child, for obvious reasons, I was very excited to be able to get the 3 starters, but nowadays I find the way it's set up to be limiting. The game doesn't force you to put the starters in your team, but it offers them pretty early on, and it doesn't offer decent alternatives of their types until late in the adventure. So most of the players are going to use them, making Kanto an even more repetitive experience. At least 4 of the 6 members of your team will practically always be the same, and that's not even counting Snorlax. If they wanted to introduce the 3 starters at such an early point and maintain the series' philosophy of encouraging each adventure to be different, I think in Yellow it would have been especially important to work on the viability of a greater number of Pokémon of most types at an early point in the adventure. But just like that, out of the blue, the second generation was released. With Gold and Silver, in recent years, a critical approach to these games has been spreading. Some complaints are justified and others are somewhat unfair if we see them in context. For example, the difficulty of finding many of the new Pokémon in Johto. In the eyes of today's generations, this seems strange, but back then the picture was different. The Pokémon of Johto were new species recently discovered in that new world, rare, mysterious, and elusive compared to the original 151 that everyone knows. Finding a new Pokémon was, at the time, considered something special and surprising, which is why most new creatures are uncommon. It's merely a different philosophy than more recent generations which encourage the use of native Pokémon. Come on, nonsense compared to the real trauma of this generation, which transcends the reality of the game itself to penetrate the very core of the cartridge, its internal battery. Without getting into too many details, the way this one works means that every save file is destined to disappear in a short period of time. I know that it can be replaced and there are ways to extract the save file with external tools, but it's not something that was available to us in the innocent early years of the franchise. As enjoyable and fulfilling as the journey is, all those experiences, memories, Pokemon, and achievements are destined to fade away like mirages of nostalgia. It's quite painful. Crystal was a nice moment before the generational leap. A better execution than Yellow in that original idea of third games that really managed to feel like the ultimate version back in the day. But it was a threat of success. Let me explain. In the future, third versions would see how they take advantage of removing the burden of their predecessors to complete the definitive experience of that generation. For example, in Black and White, they intended to make the experience as new and surprising as possible by completely eliminating the old Pokemon from the Pokédex, so that every battle would be a new discovery, at the cost, of course, of a lot of variety when it came to building teams, variety that they could finally focus on offering in the best way in Black and White too. And I think it would have been amazing if Crystal had a similar philosophy. As I mentioned before, I get that they wanted to make the Pokemon native to Johto feel mystical and inaccessible for the release of the second generation, but we already had the opportunity to experience that in Gold and Silver, so Crystal would have been the perfect opportunity to give them the protagonism they deserve, making gym leaders, Elite Four, and important characters to use this new Pokemon to give more variety to their teams. The same also applies to wild Pokemon. The fact that many Johto creatures were so hidden and restricted in the early months after the release of the games gave them a very nice touch of mystery, but for Crystal, making this Pokemon accessible at an early point would have expanded the possibilities of viable teams a lot. Now it's time for the wonderful third generation. Simpler times, but with a latent danger hidden in the shadows. There was no trace of many of the Pokemon from the first games on the cartridge, and they remained inaccessible in a strange limbo during the first years of the generation. This was the result of a change in the game's philosophy, moving from a second generation that was extremely dependent on Gen 1 to a new world that encouraged you to explore and approach the new Pokemon from the beginning. For me, it was the right move, but I think it wasn't all so innocent, and there were some ulterior motives in that change. Colosseum, XD, and the Kanto remakes could arrive to fill the gap and make all Pokemon accessible again, and this went pretty much under the radar, but it was a very important change in the way the games were planned. In the first two generations, the young and eager Game Freak, with its hits and misses, was known for giving its best at all times. They made each game as if it was the last, following the idea of the most complete Pokemon adventure possible for that moment, without thinking about what would come next. But from Ruby and Sapphire, it was not just a matter of making the best game for the time, but also to consider future generations and projects when making certain decisions, even if it was to the detriment of the games, as was the case. Unlike what has happened since Sword and Shield, all Pokemon were present in the game code, and they even spent time making new sprites for each one of them. Setting up a small area where many of these would appear in the post-game could have been easy and make the game feel much more well-rounded, but they decided to leave all those side quests out for the simple fact that it would make the Kanto remakes and GameCube titles work better, considering how the battle tower is on a distant island only accessible by ferry instead of integrated into the region like the original one in Crystal. I'm starting to suspect that even the battle frontier was already planned back then, but they left it out of the game to simply have something to create hype for the future Emerald version. Going even farther, it has been confirmed that at some point it was planned to include a trip to a past Johto in the post-game of Ruby and Sapphire, imitating the trip to the Kanto of 3 years later from the previous generation. This has always been excused with the lack of time and space on the cartridge, but seeing what they could do in games that are temporarily close to them and for which they didn't have a lot more time available for development, it doesn't make much sense to me. I feel like it was more related to the fact that they already had in mind the idea to start releasing remakes, and they considered that revisiting old regions might make a future version of these games lose steam. By the third generation, the game became a significantly more refined product, and Pokémon was established as an organized and astute company, but I miss that original drive to create the best possible experience at the time, no matter what. Although in the future there were some glimpses of that love and detail for the series, I feel that it was in these games that the Pokémon franchise truly moved towards commercial success as a priority. On the other hand, Fire Red and Leaf Green are among my favorite versions, and perhaps the ones I struggled the most to find objective problems. The purpose they had, which was to update the first generation to make it enjoyable at the time while preserving its original touch of innocence, was accomplished brilliantly, and they truly are very detailed games. The closest thing to a problem I can find are, rather than failures, personal heartbreaks, features that I was obsessed with at the time and sadly could never access. The Birth Island, the Navel Rock, the secret Pokemon of the Altering Cave of Outcast Island, and a long list of wonders that a great majority of players were not able to experience. The secrecy and inaccessibility of these events, which required going to specific places on specific dates, had some sort of romantic feel to it, but it was no less painful and traumatic that it all stayed in just my dreams. Emerald closed the Game Boy era, and people tend to see the addition of both Team Aqua and Magma as an interesting and attractive new feature of these games, but for me it is by far the worst thing about this third version. I can't understand why this decision was made. Rayquaza descends from the heavens to protect the balance between the two titans, and the idea of making both teams two sides of the same extremist mentality is fine, but the execution is disastrous. We went from a villainous team, relatively enjoyable and not very intrusive to deal with, to add to the original story another side quest of beating even more grunts, one as awful as the Magma Hideout, infested not only with grunts but for some reason I will never understand, wild Pokemon, making that part of the game infinitely more obtuse and boring than its predecessors. I get that they had to find the location for Groudon's awakening and the final battle with Maxie, but was it really necessary to artificially extend the game with this torture? But besides the game's pacing problems, perhaps what I find most annoying is how the plot doesn't make use of the coexistence of the two teams for absolutely nothing interesting. We could have seen open warfare between the two, how they sabotage each other. Instead, the game chooses to make a copy-paste of the few interactions between the two in Ruby and Sapphire, which is completely absurd if you consider that only one of the two was the antagonist there. The other team, Magma in Sapphire and Aqua in Ruby, were sort of anti-heroes who founded their group to balance things out and mitigate the havoc of the other team wanted to produce in the ecosystems. I think this dynamic is far more interesting, although there is not as much focus on it as I would like. But then it was the era of the Nintendo DS. It has already been repeated over and over that Diamond and Pearl have problems of rhythm and speed, so I will leave that for Platinum. And as the biggest problem for Diamond and Pearl, I choose the other major heartbreak I had with this generation back in the day, the legendary Pokémon. No, I'm not talking about any of this in particular. My problem is the drastic and sudden change in the way of understanding them. From shy and elusive creatures spoken of in folktales for their great power and illusory beings whose existence was considered a myth, Sinnoh pulled out of its sleeve a Poké-genesis of creation in which the legendaries were suddenly creator gods involved in the origin of the universe in one way or another. Although there was already a precedent with Groudon and Kyogre, it was an isolated case following the rest of the legendaries of the third gen the original idea, and the legend was ambiguous. The folk tales of home said that from their quarrels the region was created, but up to that point it could be considered just another legend. From this point on, there was no room for doubt about that, and it affected not just new legendaries. Suddenly all the previous ones were also given a role in the world creation, which led to multiple discrepancies. This isn't a negative thing on its own, it's a matter of taste, but I personally miss the original romantic idea of the legendaries. Enigmatic creatures, powerful yet at the same time fragile, but still earthly beings. But soon after Platinum was released, and a widely repeated mantra in the community is how it fixed all the pacing problems of the generation, something I believe wasn't entirely the case, even if there were minor improvements that helped with some of the more desperate things, such as the speed of the menus and the character when surfing. The problem was too deep and ingrained in the game's story to completely fix the generation with such superficial changes. There's a constant feeling throughout most of the game where you just wander around the region and from time to time find Team Galactic doing stuff. My problem with Platinum is that it had plenty of tools to correct that. They introduced a group of interesting characters that could easily have been used to make more interesting sequences, but instead they barely appear, and for what they bring to the table, it would have been better if they didn't even appear at all. The overuse of HMs isn't fixed either, with defog still being among the most pointless things in the series, and the combination of that clunky progression and empty development is still pretty much as devastating as ever, which to me is especially bad when you are releasing a new title to create the definitive experience of this generation. However, new remakes were released, this time with Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which featured a pathetic Team Rocket, but that wasn't just bad enough. Those remakes kept the simplicity of Gold and Silver but improved it, reinterpreting aspects of the plot that were not used or remained implicit and were not fully understood. For example, the clever introduction of the Kimono Girls subtly tests us throughout the journey and proved that we are worthy of the legendary's attention. Silver's development, which in the originals was implied in details that the game didn't tell you directly and you had to interpret, is better explained and expanded with his past in Celebi's event. Even the gym leaders and other characters appear in extra scenes that make them much more memorable and sympathetic. This game makes the most of the elements that were already on the board, respecting its essence and original idea. That's why it's so difficult to understand what they did with Team Rocket. This was clearly meant to represent a decadent team, in shambles after Giovanni's disappearance, committing acts more radical and malignant than ever, all just to achieve the pathetic goal of controlling the radio tower and make a call to their leader wherever he might be so that he can restore their hope. They didn't even have their own sprites and began to illegally traffic slowpoke tails like a dealer from a local street. They were perfect for how they realistically portrayed the downfall of a criminal organization, and at the time it was a super original idea for a video game industry full of generic antagonists who wanted to dominate the world. The remakes killed that essence. Instead of exploiting the technological leap to better explain their downfall, the logistical problems, or the psychology of its leaders clinging to a hope on the verge of demise, they instead reduced the new Team Rocket to a generic group in no man's land. Their dialogues were rewritten in such a way that they no longer seemed to be struggling for their survival, losing their incoherent and radical actions the justification they previously had for being so hopeless. They turned this interesting approach to criminal gangs into a second-rate Team Rocket, with 4 executives with very fancy designs but who don't bring anything remarkable to the table. But the final straw was Giovanni. In the second gen, the icing on the cake was how the call of this Neo Team Rocket was epically ignored by him, which made them look like a bunch of useless punks. But in the Celebi event of the remakes, out of the blue, now it turns out that Giovanni heard their call with a radio in a cave? What? out and decides to go help them, which goes totally against the development that the villain had in the first gen by being defeated by Red. If they wanted to introduce Giovanni again, they had the chance to write something really great. For example, the YouTuber Smith's Plays Pokemon made some changes to the story of its ROM hack that I think are incredibly on point. In this one, a mysterious man appears occasionally to help the player with the plot of Team Rocket. Eventually, this character is revealed to be Giovanni, and he certainly goes to the radio tower, but not to refound Team Rocket by killing his entire development, but to teach Archer a life lesson, that true power is not about domination, but understanding and respect, something he finally learned 3 years ago. And with that, we had seen in depth my dislikes of the first 4 classic generations. Gen 5 was something of a turning point, so let's take the chance to let the topic rest for now and come back very soon with a second part, covering the most modern games. Follow me on social media to keep up with my Pokemon art and journey, and if you are still hungry for more heartbreaks, check out the on-screen video about Pokemon that were replaced without mercy. Be nice!